Open the pod bay doors, Hal.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
We assume that's the Bahamas. 544 miles per hour, 46, 56 degrees.
Hey, hello everyone. My name is Sunjo Huang. I'm the psychiatrist at the UNMC. I'll be doing I'll be the moderator for tonight. Thanks for coming here and enjoy. I hope you all enjoyed the film. It was great for me. We have a really great panel here, so I'll just move on to the panel and hear from them about their thoughts on the film, and we'll move to you guys, and we want to share your thoughts as well. So AJ, why don't you start with introducing yourself quickly and give some thoughts on the film?
Sure.
By the way, thanks for the ramen today. It was really great.
You're welcome.
Yeah. I hope your apprenticeship was not as hard as the movie.
Well, I didn't study ramen nearly as long as I think she did. This movie was really fascinating for me. If anything, I'm hungry now, even though I was eating popcorn the whole time. So my name is AJ Swanda. I'm the chef owner of Ugly Duck. So this is really inspiring for me to watch somebody kind of I've just gone through all the same things she just did. Over the past year and a half or 2 years, I've gone back and forth, refining the recipes for every ramen that we do here or do at Ugly Duck, and seeing people try the ramen and not be happy or not be satisfied, and trying to appease so many different people and what their thoughts on ramen should be, because she's really tailoring to specific tastes, as we kind of do as well. So it was really inspiring to kind of watch her and see as she grew through those different trials and tribulations, and just the way that people eat ramen is just so much different than what we observe, or what I observe at Ugly Duck. It's really interesting to see the differences in culture, how they approach noodles, how they approach broth, and even how people approach chopsticks and spoons, or renge as they're called. So
There was almost a philosophy to it.
yeah, there really is. I mean, the way that one goes about, the very beginning when they're reading a book and you have to just caress the pork. I do that too. Just kind of loving it before I just mow down on all of it. So yeah, it's eating in and of itself is his own language, and I think we saw that throughout the movie. So yeah, that's what I got.
Thanks. James, so when I see the movie, I just realized that it's full of, it's very rich in terms of sensual stimulation, not just the visual effect, but the provoking the sound and the texture and taste. And so as a neuroscientist, can you give your perspective on the movie? You can start with introducing yourself. And
So hi there, I'm James Blair. I run the new Center for Neurobehavioral Research at Boys Town Hospital. We don't do very much to do with eating at Boys Town Hospital, but what I'm going to very briefly tell you is just a little bit about what your brain's been up to for the last hour and a half when you've been watching the movie, or at least certain images and the sounds and indeed the sort of visual textures with respect to food. And there's really 4 core regions of the brain that are really, really responsive when you're looking at food stimuli. There's the amygdala that we actually heard that also gets activated when you see zombies, but it gets activated in a very different way when you're seeing food. Ventral medial prefrontal cortex is immediately just above the eyes. There's a region called the insula that sort of stretches back down here, but we're really talking about this very anterior bit. And there's a region called striatum, which I'm not even going to try to point to you in the brain, but it's right in the middle bit, and it's an impossible way to explain the geographical location without pictures. So these are 4 core areas. The reason why I'm stressing up these 4 core areas, they're the 4 core areas as well that do all types of emotional processing. They allow you to represent the value of what you're seeing. And in fact, just like Sunja was saying about the textures, the sights, the sounds, all that you're doing when you're looking at food in those sort of ways is representing the expected value to you when you get to consume. Like AJ was just saying, he's now feeling hungry. He's just been bombarded by visual images saying how strong reward signal these food are. Particularly cruelly, he gave us that rather delicious food at the beginning of the movie. So we had that really strong sensory representation of highly valued food, which we then got bombarded by more cues for that thing. One of the things I read this afternoon in anticipation of this meeting that was slightly surprising to me, but quite entertaining, I thought at least, was the strength with which you show that response to food stimuli in these visual regions correlates with the expectancy of having weight-related disorders 12 months later. So there you go. If you were really buzzing when you're watching that, you're in trouble in 12 months' time. The other thing I'll very briefly mention, and then I'll leave it again, is the fact that there was quite a lot of erotic stimuli in that movie. And in fact, you see exactly the same regions of the brain. Again, erotic stimuli, highly rewarding stimuli, highly associated with a lot of subjective value. Exactly the same regions showing a very strong response. Slightly different ways they do it, but very strong regions. One thing again, I read in anticipation of this afternoon. I'm not completely sure I buy into this study, but apparently, according to this published study, the stronger with which these regions are activated when you're seeing these sort of visual stimuli is correlated with the probability that you enjoy doing nefarious activities, or at least watching nefarious activities on your computer screen when you go home. So maybe a little bit dampened down is a good thing in this particular
What about the
context.
relation to violence? Because there's also this argument about in the movie that also is mixed into this all pleasure-seeking and erotic stimuli.
Well, there's certainly, many of those emotion regions, the amygdala is a really core region as part of the sort of input conditions to generate rage-type aggressive responses. Ventromedial, in this case, here it gets a bit more complicated because it's really signaling value. And in fact, in most circumstances, you're representing the costs of actually engaging in violence rather than the rewards of engaging in violence. There are certain circumstances where that doesn't hold, but most of the time you're representing the costs. But indeed, these regions are, again, very important because in some respects, there's core aspects of emotion that keep you away from engaging aggression, as well as core aspects sometimes when you're in that rage response that may get you lashing out, baring teeth, and possibly even aggressing.
All right. Thank you. Pam, as an anthropologist, spent quite a time in Japan. I give a really nice introduction. I really appreciate it. Can you give some more thoughts after we saw this movie together?
Sure. One of the things that I really love about this film, is there anyone in here who's seen this film before? Repeat. Okay, awesome.
Oh, wow.
I've seen this film probably 10 or 15 times because I teach it, and I love this film. I could watch it over and over and over again. And I think one of the reasons for that is because there are these pieces that are over the top. I love to listen to new audiences and how they respond. And it was great to hear everybody laugh at all these different places that, I also think are funny. But I love it as an anthropologist because you can see things like kata. Okay, so AJ was talking about the way that you eat ramen, the way that you make ramen. There's a word for the way in Japanese, and it's kata. So I can tell my students, this is a Japanese concept that people talk about all the time. The way to draw calligraphy, or the way to eat something, or the way to take off your shoes when you go into the house. That's kata.
There's a whole art about drinking tea.
Yes, chado. So I can show them this film, and I can say, all right, food is good to think with. And I wish that I could say I coined that, but I didn't. That's Claude Lévi-Strauss, a very famous anthropologist. Food gives us this way to think about culture and to think about people and to think about relationships. And so that's the other thing that I love about this when we're talking about food and sexuality, all of these very powerful emotions and how those are linked. One of the reasons why I mentioned earlier, I show this film and then I show Spirited Away. Through food, you can see people entering relationships, people communicating through food. A shrimp is never just a shrimp, an oyster is never just an oyster. A bowl of ramen is never just a bowl of ramen. So this is why I just really love this film. The humor that comes through, the over-the-top. I could talk more about things like stereotypes and things like that, just kind of push you to think about, what's like the one that gets me every time is the mother, right?
What's your thoughts on that? Because she actually started as a pretty good cook at home.
Yeah.
But she's not good at chef, and she started from there and going all the way.
One of the things I like to ask is, okay, so Tampopo is a pretty good cook, right? At home. Why isn't she a good cook or considered to be a good chef? Cook versus chef. Why is she not a good chef? And what does it take for her to become a good chef? Now, this film is from the 80s, right? And it is a social critique, as I mentioned before. Mm-hmm. They're pushing some of these ideas or stereotypes that Itami was very aware of. It existed in Japanese society, but it still replicates them, right? So it takes 5 guys to come in and teach this woman how to make ramen. And if you want to watch a film not a film, if you want to watch a segment that's kind of similar to this, you can watch Chef's Table and watch the master chef at Ennaka. So this is her story of her restaurant. She's a Japanese woman. She's a lesbian. She says, it's really hard for me as a female, as a lesbian woman, as an Asian American woman, put all of these layers of person onto me, and I don't go out and meet the kyakusan or the clients. I actually close the window so they can't see who's preparing the food. And so it's really easy maybe also for us to kind of think, oh, this is a bunch of Japanese ways of doing things, or he's poking fun at Japanese society, but we could probably come up with a similar list of things.
And also,
to talk
I think
about
it's
here.
still contemporary because I've been to Japan like a million times. I'm a sushi person. I've never encountered the female sushi chef in any restaurant in Japan. So we probably want to move to the taking some questions and then having your thoughts heard as well.
Hi, I just wanted to make a comment, but you said about the sushi chef, because my father is a first-generation Japanese or American from Japan, and my mother is a naturalized citizen. But I remember my father telling me how you will never see in Japan a female sushi chef, and apparently it's very interesting because apparently he was telling me how the concept was that when a woman has her certain time of the month, her taste buds change, and therefore it takes away from the consistency of being able to prepare the rice, which I found a very interesting social norm that was accepted in Japan.
Wow.
One
There's
of
any
the-
scientific basis for this, James?
I've never had. I mean, there are hormones have a massive influence on particularly on your emotional system. I've never heard it was about taste buds, but emotional processing there's clear data on. But the taste buds, that's getting a bit further away. I mean, there might be. I'm not going to say there isn't, but I find it unlikely.
And I think you have a follow-up comment.
Yeah, just to follow up, who's seen Jiro Dreams of Sushi? Yep, okay. I showed this one for my students too, and there's a section in there where I stop when I show the film because the masters are all talking. Actually, if you look at that film, there are no women in that film. There's one who's a customer. I stop at a certain point because all the masters, the guy who grows the rice, one of the guys who supplies the fish, and Jiro are all talking. And they say, the translation is, I don't have a son. So for a rationale for why somebody's not passing on the shop. But the Japanese, he says, literally, I only have a daughter. So the nuance is totally changed, right? So just to follow up kind of on your comment, like these are some of these really strong ideas that, believe them or not, scientific data, if we have it or not,
It's unlikely
they're very ingrained ways of thinking.
It's very unlikely that these ingrained ways of thinking have anything to do with the scientific. I mean, the science generated them. They came out of all sorts of strange and wonderful ways. So,
Right. Any other comments or questions?
This is kind of a cinematic style question. So I haven't seen that many Japanese films, but when I think of, for example, you show this with Spirited Away, I think of that as typical of Miyazaki, lots of long sequences and not very abrupt transitions. And this movie reminds me of like House or Hausu, in the humor and in those quick changes and, immediate not even juxtapositions, just total kind of like off the wall, strange, different scenes and places and things going on. And is that particularly because there's so much comedy in the movie, or just the difference in different directors, or what would you say about the style?
It's really funny that you should say House, because that's one of the few like kind of horror movies that I've actually seen. You guys can feel free to chime in here too, because there's several genres of film that I'm not actually that familiar with, but it's definitely a typical way of kind of Japanese slapstick is kind of like that. There's another there's a series that you might be interested in if you like this called Shinya Shokuro or Midnight Diner, and they do kind of a similar thing, and it's a more recent series. I think there's maybe 10 or 12 episodes. So yeah, I think that that's part of, in some ways, Japanese comedy. I wouldn't say that all directors do that, but this kind of like in your face. Who's the Sunjo? We were talking the other day about Memories of Matsuko, and who's the? I always forget. The
Oh
director.
yeah, what's the? I forgot the name of the director.
Nagashima? Is it
Yeah,
Nagashima?
something like that.
His movies aren't really funny, but he does the same kind of aesthetic with just this like over the top kind of like scene to scene to scene, like you almost kind of get a little bit lost.
I think I have a really quick follow-up comment on it. I'm not an expert on any Japanese movies at all. I was just growing up in Korea with a lot of relatives in it, born and raised in Japan. 80s is actually a really interesting time in terms of Japanese movies because there was almost like death of the film industry. It had a prime time in the 50s and 60s, and the 70s was a kind of slow decline. There's still some good directors like Suzuki Seijun. The 80s was like really dead. And when I actually saw this movie, it reminded me of a lot of TV like series I watched it, when I was growing up in the 80s. So I thought that's kind of interesting. Maybe that's a way of making film back then, because probably those people have a lot of work in the TV industry as well. So yeah. Any other comments or?
Why are Japanese women allowing this sexist phenomenon in like making sushi or ramen to continue? Like, why aren't there like Pussy Riot sushi restaurants?
This is a very good question.
Yeah, I'm not sure there's not nowadays. I could text a friend, he would know for sure. But I don't know.
The person that comes to mind is this woman called Rokude Nashiko, and her name translates, that's her artist name, translates into not a good girl. And she's kind of awesome. She's done all sorts of things. Like, my research is on HIV and infectious disease, and I also study food. So I've gone to a bunch of festivals that look like they venerate male genitalia, like with a giant penis around the temple and the shrines, and the big parades and things like that.
Memories.
And Rokude Nashiko is kind of famous for making sculptures of vaginas and saying, if you can have a giant phallus be paraded around, why not a vagina kayak? Or things like that. And so I wouldn't say that we have to be really careful about the kind of blanket statement that all Japanese women would allow this and would say, like, this is okay. I definitely think that there are certain waves of, or certain brands of Japanese feminism that are saying, like, no, this is not okay, and figuring out ways to subvert that. But I will also say that Rokude Nashiko has been taken to court and told that her work is pornographic and slapped with suits and stuff. So you know what I mean? It actually, she's taking stands and facing sometimes jail time, to do that sort of stuff. So that's just kind of an extreme example. But yeah, it's a good question.
We have another question over here.
I'm not sure quite how to phrase this, but there were times in the film when I felt like I was watching an American Western, and other times when it seemed to go the American gangster route. Were there other genre tributes in the film that I missed, or background on it would be interesting?
Do you want to take one?
I'm not a film studies.
AJ.
I watched some Japanese films. I think that this is like pre Pokemon and definitely, I mean,
Pokemon, yes.
anime. But you see where those lineages, like where they tie together a little bit. The fight scene in particular was just silhouettes. I think that really spoke to me as like something that you definitely then see in anime moving forward, for sure. And the, like the red faces as they're like, it just hit me like as they're all like dying, like they're all dining and like I don't know, the helper guy is like ordering.
I think basically the story frame is a Western.
Yeah.
The stranger shows up and they save the town and leave the town.
Exactly.
So it's like Shane or
exactly.
any John Wayne movie.
Absolutely.
That's the analysis that I have seen. People have kind of looked at it as a spaghetti western and kind of
ramen western.
Yeah, calling it a ramen western, and taken it apart that way.
But the other movie actually I was reminded of a lot is Seven Samurai.
Yeah.
Because the same, like just a lot of people, bunch of people got together and then save the town and leave and go their way. So.
Sukiyaki Western Django is another one. It's kind of like that.
No, we need
Have you seen the movie East Side Sushi? Because it reminded me an awful lot of this, where it's a Mexican-American immigrant who, she's a woman, and she's trying to, it's on Netflix, but she wants to be a sushi chef. And her dad is a Mexican, obviously, and she starts making sushi, and it's the same thing. It's a group of men who teach her how to make sushi, and she competes in this competition to become a female sushi chef in Los Angeles. And it's just fascinating. The parallels are so similar, and it's also very charming and sweet, and it's this lovable female chef who works really hard and almost gives up, and it just reminded me, and I just looked it up online, and it looks like it was made in 2014, and so I wonder if it was not inspired by this movie.
Oh, that's a good point.
Definitely worth checking out.
Yep. Thanks for the comment.
Hi, thank you. This movie was great. AJ, I actually had a question for you, because in the film we see a lot of, Tampopo doing a lot of research for her broth and her noodles, and I'm not asking for your recipe, don't worry. But I just wanted to know, in terms of like texture.
$30,000.
Come on, man, it's my life.
In terms of texture and weight and the balance of salty and sweet and the vegetables, what kind of research did you do to come up with your ramen recipes?
It's a long story, but like I've been cooking for 10 years now. Mostly Italian and French is like what I've studied the most, and so I bring that kind of style. I bring French technique to my broth a little bit, but then just like she did and ate like everywhere. Anytime I go to a city, anytime I get outside of Omaha, I'm eating at every ramen shop I possibly can. I went to Japan in April. I like ate ramen 4 times a day. So it's like a lot of tasting and eating, and deciding what my palate wants and what I think Omaha as a city will want, because that's who I'm making ramen for. And so knowing food science a little bit, knowing how carrots will react with bones, and how the acidity of the water will affect everything, and how long we boil it versus how long we just let it sit at 180 degrees for 24 hours. All these little things affect like what the broth goes into, or what goes into the broth, I guess. It's really complicated. I mean, we see ramen as Americans. I think we're all introduced as like the packet, right? The 99-cent or whatever top ramen packet. And so that's how we are introduced to ramen. It's this whole other world outside of this. They go in depth about the lye water and the noodles. I mean, we get our noodles from Sun Brand, but they literally have 150 different styles you can order. So there's so many variables that go into each and every broth. So it's difficult. How I got to where we're at, how I got to the broth that Ugly Duck has now, is really convoluted. It's really complicated. I think it's actually overcomplicated. After watching this, I was like, I want to tear it all apart and start over again.
How accurate was it, the way depicted in the movie?
I mean, it's pretty accurate. I mean, when you see like the whole chicken or the whole pig's head, that's pretty accurate. Or her like sawing the bones. When she's sawing the bones and like cracking them in half, she's making tonkatsu. Or like a boiled pork broth, which is different than the broth you would use the whole chickens in. So it's all really accurate. It's just you have to know what you're looking for, I guess. I don't know.
Did you go through any garbage cans to discover recipe secrets?
No, there's no garbage cans, but there's definitely times when you eat ramen. Like I go to a shop and I eat ramen. It's like, well, did they really just take this from a can because it tastes like that? I mean, there's times it's just like, this is garbage. Like, throw it away. But
Okay.
sure. Does that answer your question? I hope.
Yeah.
Cool.
What about the cloudiness?
So I'm a huge fan of cloudiness. None of my broths are like clear, and that has to do with there's a couple different ways you can go about getting clear broth. I think the more fat you have in your broth, the richer it is, the more I like it, and I think everybody else tends to agree that way. But there is something to be said about clear broth, and you do that at a low temperature for a very long time, so you don't agitate the bones or the blood or anything in the broth at all. It kind of stays still, and you extract flavor that way. You get a really clear broth that's really popular in Japan. And then you put your tare. I don't know if you noticed this, but like they've added a ladle of soy or something to every broth. That's tare. In the Uncle Chuck, we use soy as well, the ramen you all had. And as you stir the broth at like the very beginning, that kind of mixes all up, and then you get your cloudiness. So, yeah.
All right. Thanks.
Yeah.
Wait,
Hold on
hang
one second.
sec.
I'm going to bring
Oh,
this.
So just bouncing off of that, I really appreciated this film just because like I am a foodie as well, and AJ Ramen was really good.
Thank you.
But I think like a lot of people were grossed out about the pig head, like knowing those things are kind of like norms versus like, you know, American cuisine, and so like when, like there's like that borderline of like sexuality and like food, but for a lot of people like food is just so amazing, and so like when you see that kind of connection, you kind of like you get it, and so I really like that aspect of the movie a lot. I think just I don't know about food a lot, and
Well, I think it like really makes the food real, like having a whole pig's head like in the film, right?
because like people are just grossed out about it, but you know it's just like the norm.
Have you used that yourself?
Yeah.
Oh, you have? Okay.
So previously, before Ugly Duck, I worked at a restaurant called the Boiler Room, which I don't know if anybody's been there. It's definitely worth a shot,
Made
worth a
some
try.
head cheese.
Yeah, there's a huge pig's head in the restaurant, and we serve pig head there occasionally, whole roasted. But it's key to remember that all protein-based food comes from an animal that was once alive. They all have heads.
Okay.
And usually they're pretty delicious too. So.
Well, I don't think oysters have heads, though.
Sure.
Well, if you look at old cookbooks, like The Joy of Cooking, which has gone through, I think now, like 5 iterations or something like that, they used to have the directions for how to buy, you know, a live chicken and how to pluck it, how to kill it, all that sort of stuff. So you can, through cookbooks, you can actually trace, you know, the way that we as a society have kind of distanced ourselves from slaughtering our own game or our own meat or knowing those sorts of things and buying cellophane wrapped packages at the grocery store. So that's just a
One of the surprising features when you're working at Boys Town is as it gets into the autumn season, you're suddenly asked whether you want to have various animal products from the farm that is at Boys Town. And when you read the first, well, certainly when I read the first email for the very first year, at the tail end of last year, when they suddenly start, would you like to buy a pig? I thought, oh my goodness, they're going to give me a whole pig to take home. And either it's dead or it's alive, but whichever one is going to be really difficult for me. I do not have your skill set. It's just going to be horrible and messy. And well, you'd have to come round. And
You know anatomy, it's all the same.
yeah, but still, no.
It's just laid out a little differently.
Anyway.
All right. Should we go on? Take more questions?
Yeah, we have time for more comments or questions, reactions about the film itself.
right.
I'd seen Tampopo, I don't know, 5 or more years ago, and this is probably the second time I'd seen it, and I'd forgotten how episodic it was. And this just popped into my mind. It's not a very good parallel, but it makes me think a little of Pulp Fiction with multiple storylines. I guess in Pulp Fiction they kind of came together a little more plot-wise. Here I guess they're unified by the centrality of food to the various characters, but you've got kind of the core story, and then you've got the gangster, you've got the dying mother making her last meal, ironically, for someone else. that just for some reason popped into my mind as sort of a parallel you see in some other film.
As a mother of a young boy, I felt really focused on the son of Tampopo and how he was affected by her relationships with all these different characters kind of coming in and out of the picture, and that he was a fatherless young boy, and in the beginning he was getting beat up and all these struggles that he had, and through the course of these relationships that his mother fostered with these other mentors that she had met, he really found, the strength to kind of claim his stake and get that, so to speak, manly example of how to kind of step up. And so I found that incredibly charming about the film.
I have to say,
do you see any experience from Boys Town?
Yeah, I did find that element of the movie, maybe it was...
James, do you mind pulling that mic a little closer?
I was a bit concerned about that element of the movie, in fact, actually, because there was the strong implication that it was going to be very difficult for this boy to grow up without having that access to those male role models, and it didn't seem to be treated in at all an ironic fashion whatsoever. So that was one. I've seen the movie now a few times, and I do really like the movie, but there are a couple of things in the movie that make me quibble, and that actually is one of them. You're right in some respects, but it's clearly important. There's a huge literature on the importance of having, the utility of having both, genders in a successful relationship. But at the same time, the implication was that this really wasn't going to happen, and there's a good deal of data to suggest that that is not the case, that it is possible easily possible for these things to occur in the absence of one or other. So that just got me, because in some respects it's such a cliche that you need that, and then this movie was embodying and sort of reinforcing that cliche even when it was going after other cliches. So from a parenting point of view, the literature it is a good idea, but it's definitely not an inevitably critical idea, if that made sense.
I think if you look at it from like a sociocultural perspective, and you think about Tampopo as a single mother in the 1980s, what would her socioeconomic life have been? She would have been really poor without having a spouse at that time. It would have been very difficult for her to have a financially stable life. And so, then you become the kid who doesn't have the nicest clothes, or the mother can't buy the new school uniforms, and those are little things that kids would pick up on. And so he would get bullied and things. But the better that his mother does, the better that his status would rise too. So I think I see what you're saying. I really agree with the what you're bringing to this as a psychiatrist. But I also think if you look at the socioeconomics of that particular time and that particular, like, owning a ramen shop, and what her chances in life would have been and what his chances in life would have been, I can see this kind of rise in status that might occur.
Suggest I was suggesting it. The clearly having the parenting unit is a useful unit to have. I wasn't trying to suggest it wasn't. It was just the suggestion that you had to have, or that you could have taken from this to be successful. That was my quibble. Not that, and indeed, and I was only really talking about it because it was a parenting message rather than a socioeconomic message. The socioeconomics are very, very clear indeed. Yeah. It's clearly much bit more useful to have two people contributing to the finances.
I think there's also, again, the social context of the 80s. I think that was sort of like the first time the bullying had become quite a significant issue in Japan.
Right.
I mean, it had been going on for a while, but in the 80s, they started talking about it quite a bit. And, Japan being a very homogeneous society, if you have like a single mom, it's a very easy target.
Yep.
I had one of my Japanese colleagues, writing up article using the word without any difficulty, like intact family.
Yeah.
So I was, what do you mean by intact? Meaning, mom and dad. So then you're meaning if there's one parent, it's not intact.
Mm-hmm.
So
The stereotype for that is very strong.
yeah.
That's, yeah.
What's the other thing really bothered you, by the way? You said a couple of things.
I mean, really, these are twiddly things. I didn't like the business about if the kid won the fight, then they all suddenly bonded together. I just found that irritating.
Is it too cheesy?
But it's also a odd message to push as well. Right. But these are quibbles. I enjoyed the movie. I really.
All right, we're gonna take one final question, and then we'll
Everyone
wrap
up
up.
here.
I've got an interesting question for the anthropologist. I've been interested in anthropology, especially revolving around food, but I'm only familiar with it from the standpoint of the American culture and the decline in cooking in the home over the past century or so. Can you speak to what happened, especially with Japan over the past century or so, and how that could have impacted this film, especially not only like the socio standpoints of this, but just like how, if there was a decline in cooking in Japan, how maybe this also spoke to that, and how it possibly even affected ramen question for AJ.
This is an awesome question. And in lieu of giving you a 100-year history of food in Japan, two things. One, there is an excellent and very short book called Noodle Narratives that I think you would be interested in reading. It's written by two anthropologists who actually trace the development of instant ramen in Japan, starting with Momofuku Ando. And they talk a lot about things like taste and why ramen works and why people like it and the science behind putting it in a cup or putting it in one of those little packages with flavor spices. And then they also talk about the globalization of that. The second thing I can tell you is that much like the United States, mass production of foods, and starting in pretty much right after World War II and into the 1950s, had major implications for home cooking, both in the United States and Japan and other places in the world. Another thing you can look at is, this book is denser and harder, but if you're interested in sugar, Sidney Mintz wrote this really wonderful book with very deep history on sugar trade in the United States and Britain and the Caribbean. So there's a few things to kind of think about. But yes, definitely, I mean, this rise in cold storage and us understanding bacteriology and how infection works and canning things. So, I mean, the rise in technology paired with globalization just changed the way that we think of food in numerous ways. So those are two that I would take a look at, and I can chat with you later if you want to know more.
And I think also you see a little bit when they're making the rice omelet, the introduction to ketchup into the Japanese cupboard, if you will. You didn't see that up until about that time, the early 80s. And so that access to sugar and also applying it towards Japanese food is really interesting in the way that at least I've seen in my short time cooking, last 10 years or so, Japanese food evolve and change.
I mean, the U.S. and Japan is an interesting relationship because basically, the United States occupied Japan for 7 years. And so with the militarization and the military presence of Japan, you have all sorts of things like ketchup and cheese. Chocolate and cheese.
Butter.
And, sorry?
Butter.
Butter,
yeah.
yeah.
I remember, my mom made a rice with butter on top.
Yeah.
So you have Spam. Spam is also a great example, and the same kind of thing happened in Hawaii. In Okinawa, if you look at their stir fries, that they have Spam in them, and that's because of the, U.S. Military connection. And Spam itself is this thing that we created to feed soldiers because it's high in fat, calories, everything that a soldier needs in order to go and do what they need to do. So, yeah, we can talk more if you're interested.
I think the introduction of American culture into Japanese society via the war is really important to the growth of food and the commercialization of things moving forward. Yeah.
Should we stop? Take one more. Just
We could do one more.
okay, just one more.
Hi. I don't want to make a broad generalization, but it seemed like a lot of the food in Tampopo was framed by meat. I think there were maybe one or two dishes I saw that were vegetarian, quasi-vegetarian. And I've seen Tampopo before, and I remember most of the film very vividly, except for the scene where they killed the turtle, which honestly I thought was a little disconcerting. Even though I eat meat, I'm comfortable eating meat. Like the fact of seeing that act on screen was a little unnerving for me personally. But I was wondering, given how framed the film is around meat and meat-centric items, we didn't see a vegetarian dish on the menu, I don't think. What is the Japanese perspective of I guess the way that we're moving to these vegetarian dishes or these vegan dishes or these gluten-free dishes? AJ, I think you have a vegetarian dish in your restaurant.
Quite a few, yeah.
But like, how does, and maybe more modern, or maybe at the time in the 80s, like how would the Japanese have thought of like if I went in and I asked Tampopo for a vegetarian ramen, what would that have? What would that interaction
you
look
could
like?
certainly have like miso ramen, but like, it's just like not a thing.
How many?
I mean, except for the Buddhists,
But that's actually
So-
a very interesting question,
That's a
because
very good question.
historically, Japanese people didn't know how to eat meat until like end of 19th century.
Sure.
They started eating beef around like 1890s and 1900s.
They had
so-
some small amounts of game. What I was going to ask AJ is, how many times have you come across vegetarian ramen in Japan?
Oh, that's a good
Because I can say once in my case.
Not really.
Once.
You don't see a lot of it. I mean, I haven't run across it. I mean, I follow just about every ramen shop noteworthy from Okinawa to Ontario,
Yeah.
and you don't see it. I mean, you see pork
Yeah.
and sometimes chicken, but
So my husband is a vegetarian, and we knew basically if we went out to eat, trying to go to a Japanese restaurant and get Japanese food for him, almost impossible. We found one great tonkatsu restaurant. So tonkatsu is pork cutlet. And the master there happened to do noodles and tonkatsu. And so one of the noodle specialties for that area is a base made from daikon, or Japanese radish, and it's completely vegetarian. And the master was like, oh my God, this big, tall, foreign dude likes this vegetarian food. This super local, made out of radishes. I never would have guessed that that's true. It's really hard. It's getting better, but it's really hard to find vegetarian or vegan food in Japan unless you're looking at shojin ryori, which is temple food made in Buddhist tradition and it's not just without meat, but it's without dairy, and it's without strong flavors like onions or garlic, different types of grasses that would normally impart strong flavors. So right now, your best bet for vegetarian food is probably an Indian restaurant or an Italian restaurant.
I just thought I'd comment very briefly on your feelings of disquiet when you're watching the movie, because again, here is a fantastic, very negative, very aversive image that you really don't want paired with food. In fact, anybody who's trying to sell you food really doesn't want paired with food. And so you see in this country, and many other countries as well, there's a strong enthusiasm to not let us get too many visual images too close to the actual acquisition of meat products, because we might find it especially with some of the industrialized farming techniques, we'd find those aversive images so strong that rather than when you're seeing one of those plates in the movie today and getting the strong reinforced image of the positive value of the taste of food, and expecting and wanting to go towards it, you would actually get these strong aversive images, because you would think your emotional association was with the turtle dying in this movie, or with an animal you might see through a factory farm. So this whole business about where your expected values go when you see particular types of visual images will determine whether you approach and go to eat, or whether you go avoid, or in fact what you choose to eat, whether it's vegetarian or meat.
Yeah. Following up on, actually piggyback to his question and comment, I still think it's a very 80s Japan, the movie. It was like a very strange time in Japan when you think about it, because the economy was like exploded,
Yeah.
and people were indulging a lot of stuff back then. I still remember, like, people were eating gold.
Yeah.
Literally, like,
Yep.
paper gold on sushi and cake.
Yep.
So the meat question probably has a lot to do with that as well. It's like a really
Well, and one of the reasons why sukiyaki was created, which is the beef that you, it's made in a giant pan and you tend to dip that in raw egg. One of the reasons that that was developed was to kind of literally beef up so that we can fight the enemy being the Americans. Like, they all eat all of this protein. We're going to have to be bigger and stronger and to fight with them. And so, I mean, the eating of meat in this way has very particular context. Yes, but a lot of times it's cooked in dashi, a soup stock that is not vegetarian.
So fish.
So it's, yes, many lovely could be vegetarian dishes. My husband will look at and be like, oh, there's definitely fish in there, isn't there? Yeah. So, sometimes you pick your battles.
All right, so probably with that, we're going to wrap up. Thank you so much for coming and sharing your thoughts and comments. And thanks for the panel. We appreciate it.
I didn't mean to fight with you at all. I'm just thinking,
So this is great. Thanks.